Hey, Holy Girls, welcome back to Holy Girl Talk. If you're a returning listener, thank you for coming back and sitting with me again. I don't take that lightly, and if this is your very first time listening, welcome. I'm really glad you're here. Holy Girl Talk is a modern faith podcast where we talk about God, scripture, womanhood, emotions, waiting seasons, and real life in a way that's honest, reflective, and very human. You do not have to have your life together to be here. You don't have to be patient, polished, or spiritually perfect. Whether you're new to faith, rebuilding your faith, have been walking with God for years, or you're just listening because you're tired and searching, this space is for you. Before we get into today's episode, quick check in. If you're listening while multitasking, unclench your shoulders, take a breath. If you haven't eaten yet today, this is your reminder to eat something and drink some water. And if Holy Girl Talk has been speaking to you, make sure you're following the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. And if this episode resonates, share it with a friend who's in a waiting season right now. We're not meant to carry these seasons alone. Today, we're talking about one of the most emotionally complicated stories in the Bible, the story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. And this is not a neat story. It's not comfortable. It's not a quick lesson with an easy moral at the end. This is a story about waiting longer than you expected, watching time pass, feeling pressure, internal and external, and wondering if God is actually going to come through the way he said he would. This story is for the woman who's been waiting on something for years, waiting for clarity, waiting for healing, waiting for marriage, waiting for a breakthrough, waiting for life to finally feel like it's moving forward. It's for the woman who started off patient and faithful, but somewhere along the way got tired. And maybe you didn't stop believing in God, but you started trying to help him. You started looking for workarounds, backup plans, ways to protect yourself from disappointment. And if that's you, I want you to know this episode is not here to shame you, it's here to sit with you. Because Sarah's story shows us what happens when faith collides with time. Hagar's story shows us how God treats the overlooked, and Abraham's story reminds us how hard it is to trust God when pressure is loud and timelines feel heavy. So, wherever you're listening from, whatever you're waiting on, and however long it's been, settle in. This is a safe conversation, and I think this story is going to meet you right where you are. Let's get into it. Before we even walk through what actually happens between Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, I want to name why this story feels so uncomfortable for so many of us. Because this isn't a clean story, there's no obvious villain, there's no single person who gets everything right. This is one of those stories where everyone is human, everyone is flawed, and everyone is responding from a place of pressure. And that alone makes it relatable. Because in real life, especially in this season we're living in now, most situations are not black and white. People are tired, people are overwhelmed, people are doing the best they can with the information, fear, and exhaustion they have at the time. And that's exactly what we see here. This story sits right at the intersection of faith and frustration. Sarah believed God. Abraham believed God. But believing something and waiting for it to happen are two very different experiences. Waiting stretches faith in a way belief alone doesn't. Waiting forces you to sit with unanswered prayers, quiet seasons, and the pressure of time passing while nothing seems to change. And if you're listening in 2026, this hits differently. We live in a world where timelines are constantly in our faces. Social media shows us who's getting married, who's having babies, who's moving forward, who's figured it out. There's an unspoken expectation to keep up, to hit milestones on time, to prove you're not behind, and that pressure makes waiting feel even heavier. So, this episode isn't about judging Sarah for losing patience or Abraham for going along with a plan that complicated everything. It's about understanding what happens to the human heart when waiting turns into weariness, when faith is still there but hope feels thinner. When you start asking yourself, do I keep waiting or do I take matters into my own hands? This story gives language to those questions, and more importantly, it shows us how God responds to them. Not with abandonment, not with disgust, but with presence, patience, and faithfulness that doesn't disappear when people make messy choices. To understand why Sarah reached the point that she did, we have to go back to the promise itself. God didn't give Abraham and Sarah a vague encouragement or a general blessing. He gave them a very specific promise. He promised them a child, a legacy, a future that would extend far beyond their own lives. And what made that promise even heavier was the timing. God spoke it when it already seemed impossible. Sarah wasn't just waiting in a neutral situation, she was waiting while getting older, Waiting while her body changed, waiting while the years kept moving forward without evidence that the promise was coming. And culturally, barrenness wasn't just painful, it was deeply tied to identity, worth, and social standing. So every year that passed wasn't just a delay, it was a reminder. And this is where the story feels painfully modern because waiting today doesn't happen in a vacuum either. We wait while watching other people move forward. We wait while timelines around us keep advancing. We wait while family members ask questions, friends hit milestones, and society quietly measures progress. And that constant comparison makes waiting feel personal, even when it isn't. Sarah believed God, but belief doesn't cancel grief. Faith doesn't erase disappointment. You can trust God and still feel the ache of waiting. And that tension is something we don't talk about enough. We act like strong faith means you're never frustrated, never tired, never tempted to give up. But Sarah's story tells us otherwise. Her waiting wasn't passive, it was active. It was heavy. It required endurance. And over time, that endurance started to wear thin. Not because she didn't trust God, but because she was human. And that honesty is what makes her story so relatable for anyone who has been holding on to a promise longer than they expected. As the years passed, Sarah's waiting didn't just stay external, it became internal. What started as hope slowly turned into quiet questioning. And not loud, dramatic questioning, but the kind that happens late at night. The kind that sounds like, did I hear God right? Did I misunderstand the promise? Am I being unrealistic for still expecting this? Waiting has a way of wearing down even the strongest faith. Not all at once, but gradually, you start off confident. Then you become cautious. Then you become tired. And eventually, you start trying to protect your heart from disappointment. And that's often where impatience begins, not as rebellion, but as self preservation. Sarah wasn't just waiting for a child, she was waiting for proof that God hadn't forgotten her. That time hadn't disqualified her, that her life still had meaning beyond what she could see. And those feelings are deeply relatable because waiting isn't just about the thing you want, it's about what waiting makes you believe about yourself. Today, waiting often feels amplified. We're constantly exposed to other people's highlight reels. We see engagement announcements, baby showers, promotions, relocations, breakthroughs, and even when we're genuinely happy for others, it can still stir grief for what we're still waiting on. That doesn't make you bitter, it makes you human. Sarah's story gives us permission to name that exhaustion without pretending it doesn't exist. Her faith didn't disappear, it was just tired. And tired faith doesn't need condemnation, it needs compassion. Eventually, Sarah reached a point that so many of us recognize, the place where waiting stops feeling hopeful and starts feeling unbearable, where doing nothing feels riskier than doing something. And in that space, she made a decision that would change everything. Sarah decided to help God along. She gave Hagar to Abraham, believing that maybe this was the way the promise would finally come to pass. And it's important to say this clearly. This decision was not born out of cruelty. It wasn't rooted in malice or bitterness. It was rooted in exhaustion, in disappointment, in the quiet fear that if she didn't act, nothing would ever change. This is what waiting can do when it stretches too long. It can convince us that control feels safer than surrender, that taking action feels wiser than trusting timing. Sarah wasn't trying to rebel against God. She was trying to survive the weight of delay. And this is where the story becomes deeply relatable. Because how many times have we stepped in prematurely, not because we didn't believe God, but because we were tired of hoping? How many times have we created backup plans, forced conversations, settled for less, or made decisions out of fear instead of peace? Not because we were faithless, but because waiting hurt. Sarah's decision teaches us something important. Impatience often disguises itself as responsibility. It convinces us we're being practical, mature, or proactive, when in reality we're trying to protect ourselves from disappointment. And while God is gracious, actions taken outside of his timing often come with emotional consequences we never intended to carry. Once the decision was made, it didn't bring the relief Sarah may have hoped for. Instead of peace, tension entered the story. Instead of clarity, things became complicated. What she thought would solve the pain of waiting actually introduced a new kind of pain, one that affected everyone involved. Sarah's disappointment didn't disappear, it shifted. Watching the promise unfold through someone else stirred insecurity she wasn't prepared for. The very plan she created to ease her waiting became a mirror reflecting everything she feared. And that's often how regret works. It doesn't show up immediately, it arrives quietly once we realize the solution didn't heal the wound. This part of the story is important because it reminds us that rushed decisions don't erase longing, they usually multiply it. Acting out of impatience doesn't resolve the ache of waiting. It often adds layers of complexity we never intended to manage. And for Sarah, that complexity showed up as resentment, frustration, and emotional distance. Many of us know this feeling. The moment when you realize the choice you made out of desperation didn't bring peace, just a different version of stress. When you recognize that trying to control the outcome didn't actually protect your heart, and that realization can be heavy. It can come with guilt, self blame, and the painful question of why didn't I just wait? But this story doesn't end with Sarah being shamed for that question. It shows us something more compassionate. It shows us that regret doesn't disqualify us from God's plan. It reveals how deeply God understands the human heart, especially the heart that makes decisions while tired, afraid, and worn down by waiting. Now we have to pause and shift our attention to Hagar because her story matters just as much, and for a long time it has been overlooked. Hagar did not ask to be part of this situation. She didn't choose the role she was placed in. She was brought into someone else's plan, carrying the weight of a decision she didn't make and living with the consequences of dynamics she had no control over. Hagar was a servant, which meant there was already a power imbalance before anything even happened. Her voice was limited, her options were limited. And once she became pregnant, the emotional tension in the household intensified. The situation became complicated quickly, and Hagar found herself caught in the middle of pain that wasn't originally hers. This part of the story speaks to women who have ever felt used, overlooked, or stuck in circumstances created by someone else's choices. Women who are asked to carry something heavy without being fully considered. Women who are expected to endure quietly while others work through their emotions. Hagar's experience reminds us that not everyone in a story of impatience is the one who acted impatiently. When tension grew and Hagar felt rejected, she ran. She fled into the wilderness alone. And that moment is significant because for Hagar, the wilderness wasn't a place of punishment. It was a place of survival. It was the only space where she could breathe, away from conflicts she didn't choose. And this is where the heart of the story opens. Because even when people mishandle us, even when we are overlooked or mistreated, God does not overlook us. He meets Hagar in the wilderness. He sees her, he speaks to her, and he makes it clear that her life, her pain, and her future matter deeply to him. In one of the most tender moments in all of Scripture, God meets Hagar in the wilderness. Not after she fixes anything, not after she proves herself, but right in the middle of her pain. Alone, afraid, carrying more than she ever asked for. God finds her by a spring of water and does something extraordinary. He calls her by name. This moment matters because it tells us something about God's character. He doesn't just see situations, he sees people. He doesn't just address outcomes, he addresses hearts. Hagar, a woman who is invisible to everyone else, is fully visible to God. And in that moment, God speaks directly to her pain, her fear, and her future. Hagar responds with words that still carry weight today. She says, "You are the God who sees me." And that declaration is powerful because it comes from someone who had every reason to feel unseen. Hagar didn't just encounter provision, she encountered recognition. She realized that even when people mishandle us, misunderstand us, or use us for their own plans, God never overlooks us. This part of the story is deeply comforting for anyone who has ever felt caught in the crossfire of someone else's decisions. For anyone who has felt discarded, forgotten, or alone in a season they didn't choose. God meeting Hagar in the wilderness reminds us that wilderness seasons are not evidence of abandonment. They are often the very places where God's presence becomes most personal. And this matters in the context of waiting, because sometimes waiting doesn't just hurt the person who's tired of waiting. Sometimes it hurts people around them too. And yet God's compassion extends to every heart involved. He sees the one who's waiting. He sees the one who's struggling. And he sees the one who feels overlooked in the middle of it all. Now let's talk about Abraham, because his role in this story is often simplified, but it's actually very layered. Abraham believed God, Scripture even says his faith was credited to him as righteousness. And yet, believing God didn't remove the pressure he felt. He was carrying the promise, carrying Sarah's disappointment, and carrying the weight of time passing with no visible fulfillment. Abraham was living in the tension between faith and pressure, between trusting God and responding to the emotions of the people closest to him. And that tension is something many of us understand. Sometimes faith isn't challenged by doubt, but by urgency, by the feeling that something needs to happen now, by the pressure to make things work, keep peace, or produce results. Abraham's choice to go along with Sarah's plan doesn't mean he stopped trusting God. It means he was human. It means he felt the pull between surrendering control and taking responsibility. And this is where the story becomes very real for anyone who has ever tried to hold faith while also managing expectations, your own and everyone else's. What Abraham's journey teaches us is that faith is not just believing God can do something, it's surrendering how and when he does it. And that's often the hardest part because timelines feel personal, delays feel threatening, and pressure makes us want to act, even when God is asking us to wait. This section of the story reminds us that surrender isn't passive, it's active trust. And when we confuse pressure with purpose, we risk stepping ahead of God instead of walking with him. What's so important to notice in this story is that God's promise does not fall apart because people make mistakes. God does not revoke his word because the timeline gets messy. Even after impatience complicates the situation, even after relationships become strained, even after pain enters the picture, God remains faithful to what he said he would do. This is such a needed reminder because so many of us carry the quiet fear that we've messed things up beyond repair. That because we acted too soon, chose poorly, or tried to take control, God is done with us. But this story tells a different truth. God's plan is not fragile, his promises are not easily broken, and his faithfulness is not dependent on our perfection. That doesn't mean there aren't consequences. Grace doesn't erase complexity, but God's grace does redeem purpose. He continues working, even in the middle of human failure. He continues shaping hearts, restoring direction, and moving things toward fulfillment, even when the path looks nothing like we expected. For anyone listening who feels disqualified because of past decisions, this part of the story is for you. God is not surprised by your mistakes. He is not scrambling to fix what you broke. He is steady, he is intentional, and he is fully capable of bringing his promises to pass, even through detours you didn't plan. This section reminds us that waiting seasons don't end because we finally get it right. They end because God is faithful, and that faithfulness doesn't disappear when we struggle. It carries us through it. After years of waiting, questioning, and complicated detours, God fulfills his promise to Sarah. She becomes pregnant. She gives birth to Isaac. And what's so beautiful about this moment is not just that the promise finally arrives, but how it arrives. Sarah laughs, and that laughter matters. Earlier in the story, Sarah laughed out of disbelief. It was the kind of laugh that comes from protecting yourself from disappointment. The kind that says, I've hoped before and it didn't happen, so I won't let myself expect too much now. But when Isaac is born, her laughter changes. It becomes joy. It becomes relief. It becomes gratitude. The same mouth that once laughed in doubt now laughs in fulfillment. This moment teaches us something important about God's timing. God didn't just fulfill the promise, he fulfilled it in a way that redeemed the waiting. The years weren't wasted. The delay wasn't random. There was meaning formed in the process, perspective, humility, depth, and dependence that could only come through time. And this is often how God works. When promises finally arrive, they don't just give us what we wanted, they give us understanding we didn't have before. They make the wait make sense. Not because the pain disappears, but because the purpose becomes clear. Sarah's laughter reminds us that God is not late, he is intentional, and when his promises come to pass, they often carry a richness that rushed fulfillment never could. When we bring this story into our lives today, it becomes clear that waiting doesn't just look like sitting still and being patient. Waiting shows up in very real, very daily ways. It looks like doing the right things and still not seeing movement. It looks like praying the same prayer over and over and wondering if it's even being heard. It looks like watching life move forward for other people while you feel paused, stuck, or left behind. Waiting today also comes with a lot of noise. There are constant opinions, timelines, and expectations telling us what should have happened by now. There's pressure to pivot, to settle, to compromise, or to create something on our own just so we're not empty handed. And that pressure can make waiting feel less like trust and more like failure, even when it isn't. This story reminds us that waiting is not passive and it's not pointless. Waiting is active trust. It's choosing not to rush what God is still shaping. It's resisting the urge to control outcomes just to quiet anxiety. It's learning how to sit with unanswered questions without letting them harden your heart. And if you've ever felt tempted to take matters into your own hands because the wait felt too long, this story holds space for you. It shows us that God understands that tension. He sees the exhaustion behind impatience. He sees the fear behind control, and he invites us again and again back into surrender. Waiting does not mean nothing is happening. It often means something deeper is being formed. And while that doesn't always make the wait easier, it does make it meaningful. Before we move into reflection and prayer, I want to pause right here for a moment because waiting seasons can feel heavy, and conversations like this can stir up emotions you didn't realize you were carrying. So, if you're listening right now, take a breath with me, relax your shoulders. If you haven't eaten yet today, this is your reminder to eat something and drink some water. You don't have to push through everything. You're allowed to care for yourself while you're doing emotional and spiritual work. And if this episode is resonating with you, I want to invite you to follow the podcast if you haven't already. Holy Girl Talk is a space we're building together, and following helps you stay connected to these conversations. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, someone who's in a long waiting season or wrestling with God's timing, share this episode with them. Sometimes hearing "you're not alone" changes everything. Waiting can feel isolating, but it's not meant to be carried alone, and neither is growth. As we start to bring this episode toward a close, I want to invite you into a moment of honest reflection, not a rushed moment, not a moment filled with pressure or guilt, just a quiet check in with yourself and with God. Ask yourself, where am I tired of waiting right now? What promise feels delayed? What prayer feels unanswered? And how has that waiting been shaping the way I think, the way I choose, or the way I show up in my relationships? Not to judge yourself for it, but to notice it. Ask yourself too, where have I tried to take control because surrender felt too risky? Where have I created backup plans, forced timelines, or made decisions out of fear instead of peace? And again, not to shame yourself, but to understand your heart. Because impatience is often just exhaustion looking for relief. And finally, ask yourself this: where do I need to trust God again? Not in a big dramatic way, but in the quiet places, in the waiting, in the uncertainty, in the parts of your life where you've been holding your breath, hoping something changes soon. If this story has shown us anything, it's that God sees every heart involved. He sees the one who's waiting. He sees the one who's tired. He sees the one who feels overlooked. And he sees the one who's made choices they wish they could redo. None of it is hidden from him, and none of it disqualifies you from his care. Just sit with that for a moment. You don't have to fix anything right now. Awareness is enough for today. God, we come to you today with open hearts and tired hands. We bring the places where waiting has worn us down, where hope has thinned, and where impatience has crept in, not because we stopped believing, but because we've been carrying the weight of delay for a long time. You see it all. You see the prayers we've whispered, the tears we've hidden, and the moments where we tried to take control because surrender felt too uncertain. Help us trust you again in the waiting. Not just in the big promises, but in the quiet in-between moments where nothing seems to be changing. Heal the places where disappointment has turned into fear, where exhaustion has turned into impatience, and where regret has tried to convince us that we've gone too far to be redeemed. Remind us that your timing is intentional, that nothing is wasted, and that you are still working even when progress feels invisible. For the women who feel overlooked like Hagar, meet them in their wilderness and remind them that you see them. For the women who are tired like Sarah, strengthen their faith without shaming their exhaustion. And for the women carrying pressure like Abraham, teach them how to surrender timelines without losing hope. Cover every heart listening right now with peace, patience, and reassurance that you are faithful to every promise you've spoken. We release our need to control outcomes. We surrender our fear of delay, and we choose to trust that what you have promised will arrive at the right time in the right way for the right purpose. As we close out today's episode, I want you to remember this. Waiting does not mean you are forgotten. Delay does not mean God is distant. And making imperfect choices does not disqualify you from God's faithfulness. His timing is not random, it is intentional. And every season you are in right now is shaping something meaningful within you. If this episode spoke to you, make sure you're following Holy Girl Talk so you don't miss future conversations like this one. And if you have questions, prayer requests, testimonies, or topics you'd love for us to talk about, you can email us at holygirltalkpodcast@gmail.com. I read them and I pray over them. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Thank you for listening with an open heart and for choosing to trust God even when the weight feels heavy. Before you go, take a breath, drink some water, and remind yourself that you don't have to rush what God is still shaping. Until next time, Holy Girl, keep trusting that God's timing is never late, never careless, and never without purpose. I'll talk to you soon.